Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is a Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
It's another episode of A Nation of Taxpayers. It is, of course, the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. And thank you once again for downloading this podcast, either via Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or listening via YouTube. And just a gentle reminder, you can help us, as always, by following and subscribing to this podcast, and also by leaving us a 5-star review. I'm your host, Duncan Barkes. Alongside me is Elliot Keck from the Taxpayers Alliance, and our special guest this week is Rupert Lowe, Reform MP for Great Yarmouth. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Elliot, good to see you as well.
Yeah, good morning, Duncan.
Rupert, I've been wanting to get you on this podcast for a while because I think at the moment you are by far and away the most interesting person in Parliament for all kinds of reasons. And we'll go through them one at a time as this podcast continues. But a potted history, former Brexit Party MEP, farmer, former chairman of Southampton Football Club as well, former Referendum Party candidate in 1997 in the general election under Jimmy Goldsmith. Was that the beginning of your political journey?
Well, before that, I got vexed about a Maastricht Treaty, which has more loose ends than a plateful of spaghetti if people cared to read it, which when I wrote to the MPs, the MEPs, the House of Lords, most of the media, I said, have you actually read this treaty? Very few of them replied. Some of them admitted they hadn't, at which point I asked them why they voted for it. They said, well, because everybody's voted for it. Well, that's frankly not good enough, and that is not good government. So that sort of alerted me to it. And then my wife got bored of hearing me getting home in the evening banging on about how the euro, surrendering our sovereignty to the euro and giving up our sovereign currency, would have been fatal. Well, as you know, all of the establishment at the time wanted the euro. John Major, Paddy Ashdown, Tony Blair, they were all absolutely gagging for the euro. None of them admit it now, but I know that was true. And so my wife said to me, well, why don't you do something about it? So I said, well, I will. I rang up the Referendum Party, Jimmy Goldsmith's lot, who were fantastic. Jimmy spent £50 million. He never gets enough praise for this. He saved the pound. He saved us, really. And so ultimately, I then stood in the Cotswolds, which is my home constituency where I have my farm, and I brought all my children up. And we had the most fantastic campaign. I mean, we had antique shop owners from Stolen the World. We had businessmen who sold second-hand machinery. We had retired civil servants. We had a real sort of a mix of people who were all concerned about the country, and we used to, everything worked. We used to leaflet trains so you'd agree. Elliot would pick you up, drop you here. He'd then drive on and pick you up. Everything worked like clockwork because people were doing it because they wanted to. And that was my first foray into politics. I realized it's difficult to stand. It's difficult to get all your papers in right. We think we live in a very open, free democracy. We don't. We live in a very closed two-party system, which is now rotten. And at the end of the day, we got all our papers in. We got 6.6% of the vote, which my team thought we were going to win. I did have to keep their feet on the ground, but we kept. I'd never lost my deposit in the general election yet. So that was my first foray. Then I did a lot for Business for Sterling. I did a lot then for Vote Leave. I've actually got I've got the sort of framed thank you from signed by, I think it was signed by Giselle Stewart, Boris, the Wretched Gove, and Matthew Elliot. So the four signatures thanking me for what I did. But as we know, when we won, we didn't get Brexit. So we then had to cog up again, go again. I got elected in the West Midlands for the Brexit Party. And then we still didn't get a proper Brexit. We still haven't got a proper Brexit. But I carried on, and here I am now at the age of 67, a pensioner, fighting for the freedom of Britain, which I shouldn't have to do.
And not getting your winter fuel allowance now.
I've never had it. I missed it. I missed it. But I feel sorry for the people coming after me because they're, as we know, the state pension is a fraud. It's a put and take scheme, which they know they'll never be able to afford as the baby boomers retire in greater numbers. So it's a fraud, a bit like the NHS and everything else. But ultimately, I feel sorry for the people coming later because the only way to solve it is to keep pushing the retirement age up and up and up. And some people may never get that.
What I like about your CV is there's a track record of insurgency here. Where does that come from?
Well, I don't think I'm insurgent. I went to a wonderful school called the Dragon School in Oxford, where we had a lot of masters who they served in the war. One of them was served on that famous railway in Burma, Pa Denison Smith, he was called, fantastic man. And so I think I've always had a strong vein of individualism, and sort of the Dragon School teaches you to question everything, never accept anything without questioning it. And another old dragon is Ambrose Evans Pritchard at the Telegraph. He was a great friend of mine at the Dragon. And I think the Dragon in those days, it's gone a bit woke now, like most schools, but we actually had to stop giving money to the Dragon School when they renamed what I was in, a house called Gunga Din. They renamed it because they thought Rudyard Kipling was racist, so it's now called Dragon House, I think. So I said, well, that's it for me. Clearly the school isn't in safe hands. I'm withdrawing our standing orders. So, but I think it's a great school. It did have a great legacy. I think post-war, we were all very fortunate. We'd fought 2 bloody European wars, and I think people really respected freedom. They respected individualism. They respected the right to do what you wanted to do as long as you weren't upsetting other people. And I think today we've lost that. I think we've become centrally planned. We've become intolerant. We've got all these laws which, like the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act and all these rules, laws, licensing. It's just embedded in the system, not only to enrich lawyers, but also to remove people's freedom. And I say, when you see, I'm saying to all my people, if you see something happening that you don't think's right, don't take it lying down. Challenge, challenge, challenge. It's your country. These people are supposed to be serving you. They're not your master.
First 6 months in Parliament, you're one of 5 Reform MPs. How have you found the last few months?
Well, I mean, look, I could see as an outsider that the two-party system, as I call it, the Reds and the Blues, had become dysfunctional. So I do like George Galloway's expression, 2 cheeks of the same backside. And I think what's happened is the Labour Party and the Tories all sort of, the Labour Party might have moved marginally left, the Tories moved very much left. So you had this sort of consensus politics, which was basically left-leaning. And half the Tory party are Lib Dems. They should go and join the Lib Dem party, as I said on Camilla Tominay's show on Saturday. I really believe that. Parliament is quite dysfunctional. I don't like the European Parliament, but as an agenda and a parliament and a structure, you knew what you were voting on. You knew what time you were speaking. You knew what time you were voting, even if the voting was completely prearranged by the majority parties under proportional representation. But in this Parliament, you never know what time the debate's happening, how long it's going to last, whether a ministerial statement's going to be put in, whether there's an urgent question, whether it's quite extraordinary. And even last night, I had to go to something. There was a vote, not a particularly important vote, but I like to be there to vote. I think that's my responsibility as an MP. But we were told we'd be voting at 7, then 7:30, and then I go to the dorm and I'm told it's going to be 8:15 to 8:30. So I left. I thought, well, I'm not going to have this ruling my life. So we are making suggestions about how Parliament works better. Equally, I think Parliament is brought into disrepute, and you may disagree with this, but when I ask a question or another MP asks a question, it doesn't matter if it's me or Jeremy Corbyn who sits behind me, at the end of the day, you ask a question, it's not answered. Now, when I chair a board meeting, if I say, Elliot, you haven't answered the question, I want an answer. There's no point in Parliament if MPs who represent their constituents ask ministers a question and it's not answered. And the public now can watch this. They can see the questions aren't being answered. And in answer to a question, in that way, it's quite dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. And I think it needs to be sharpened up and made more accountable. As you've probably seen, I've worked out how to use my 20 written questions a day. And I've come to the conclusion that rather than playing petty sort of he said, she said type stuff in the House, I'd rather ask sort of incisive questions every day. And supposedly, although they try to reword some of them, which we resist, I try to get that data and then pass it on to the British public. So they can then make their mind up. As I said, the public are the masters. They've lost sight of this. They are the electorate. They have the vote. And that's what we fought for. We fought for a sovereign parliament in Westminster where the British electorate can vote out of power those people who aren't delivering for them. but they can't decide that if they haven't got the data.
Yeah.
So all I'm doing is drilling down. It's not rocket science, asking the questions. Getting an answer is difficult. It's like trying to pin diarrhea to the wall half the time. But, you keep pushing, you keep asking, you keep drilling in vertically, horizontally. If they don't answer one, you ask another. And we're trying to get that data. And then it's, I believe, the right of the British electorate to know the answer to those questions. So we're using our Twitter account, using our Facebook account. We're communicating with our local constituents very, very actively on Facebook. We're trying to keep them in touch with what we're doing. I get criticised for not being in Great Yarmouth all the time, but I say to them, I've got a far bigger job to sort out Westminster and London, because I can't sort Great Yarmouth out until we've got a functional parliament in Westminster.
Yeah.
Everything comes from the head of the beast.
And just to drill down into some of those questions, there's this whole array of different mechanisms and different procedures that you can use in Parliament in order to get the information that you want, promote a cause. But, for a new MP, it can be really, really difficult to work out exactly how they work because Parliament is such an archaic place. But what is really fascinating is how quickly you've sort of grasped that mechanism. And, I was just looking this morning and I think, you've put in about 572 written questions. Now, I haven't compared it to every MP in Parliament, but I can be pretty confident that that's going to be one of the most of any MP. And what's really striking is how precise some of the questions are on the really individual data points that you're looking for, particularly on things around foreign national offenders and immigrants and refugees more broadly. And it's shocking how often it comes back saying we don't hold that data, but almost that answer is as important as some vague fudge, because it demonstrates how little data we have on some of these issues. And I think it shows how you've got the correct approach in Parliament, because rather than just going in and complaining in broad brush strokes, you're actually getting to the real heart of the matter, which is we know we have a problem, but we don't actually know how big and the extent of the problem yet.
Well, the first thing to say is I've got a great team. So I've got a great team of people now working with me who've worked with me for some time. They know how I think. I think I've been around long enough to understand the principles, and we've between us now got a team of people who are able to gather the questions together, as you say, because the questions are very important. If you don't word them right, they don't answer them.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know why they don't answer them. I think good government should be transparent government. If you've got nothing to hide and you're governing well, let people see it. I mean, it's like when I'm running a business, I like people to see how much money we're making every day, how much money they're making every day, how much they're contributing. I think that's the key to the whole thing. So the dynamic is transparency. So all I've done is transpose that into the way I think we should be governed. The problem is that I think the quality of people in Parliament has been reduced by Tony Blair and David Cameron, who basically, they've effectively recruited people on the basis of quotas and rather than merit. And for me, merit is the key. I don't care where people have come from, what colour their skin is, what their religion is. If they're the right people, they're the people who should be in Parliament contributing to the way in which the country is governed. I don't care whether you're of some sexual orientation or whether you're male or female or whether you're Muslim or Christian. That should be irrelevant. What it should be is based on merit and ability. And they didn't. They've hollowed out Parliament. We've got all sorts of, I think, quite lightweight people now representing their constituencies. And the problem you've got is if you have lightweight MPs, you have a lightweight gene pool from which you can select your front bench. And ultimately, your front bench, if it doesn't know what it's doing, it can't hold the civil service to account. It's hard enough, even if you're able, because the civil service has grown like a weed. We've had this Brownite and Blairite attempt to create a dependency culture. They don't want high-minded, strong, independent thinkers. They want a sort of dependency culture. That's how a state enables itself to justify its existence, because you don't actually need the state. The state should be very minimal. The rest of it, as you probably know, we weren't taxed until Walpole's time.
Yeah.
There was no tax. So we had a truly individual society. Now we haven't. We've got the opposite. We've got a Soviet-style, sclerotic, dying economy, dying democracy. And what we've got to do is we've got to try and revive it before the same happens as happened to the Soviet Union. You can see it happening. And, Rachel Reeves, with her latest budget, if she thinks that taxing her way into prosperity is going to work, I mean, I used this quote, it's a fantastic quote by a great man. Winston Churchill said, "Trying to tax yourself into prosperity is like standing in a bucket, trying to lift yourself up by the handle." And he's right. So I think we're in for the mother of all recessions next year. What Trump is doing is great for America, but it's not so good for global trade. And I think people need to tread very carefully. We've got huge rises in national insurance. We've got a huge cost of this national insurance threshold being reduced from 9,100 to 5,000. A lot of people haven't even spotted that yet, I don't think. But these increases £600 an employee. And yet, where are the cuts in the state? Where's the cut in these people who aren't contributing? They're a dead weight on the back of an increasingly small private sector. And this is why the TPA does such a good job in exposing where's all this wasted money going? This tax that they raise. I'll tell you where it's going. Down into a black hole. And to try and justify another 22 billion being lobbed into the NHS as some form of investment, nonsense. It's being spunked up against the wall. That's what's happening to it. Like it always has been. You watch the NHS, it is dysfunctional.
It's really interesting what you say. I mean, there are a number of points there. First off, it's very clear that this cabinet that we have there's no one in that cabinet who's ever run a business in their entire life who's lied awake at night thinking, how am I going to meet this month's payroll? You can see it.
3 of the front bench have got a modicum of business experience. I would argue irrelevant, but a modicum.
Yeah, they try and talk a good game because even today you've got the Chancellor Rachel Reeves talking about her iron fist against waste. And I don't think there are many people now in the country who can believe a word that comes out of her mouth.
I don't think you can. I mean, Rachel from Accounts, as we've nicknamed her in the Reform Party, I mean, she can't even get her CV right. I mean, I've asked for her official CV because it keeps mutating. Was she an economist? What was her relevant experience to being Chancellor of the Exchequer? Honestly, come on.
Yeah. Before Elliot goes through some of the issues that I know you're keen to highlight on this podcast, just one more question about, actually it's a lie, 2 more questions. One question about how Parliament has reacted to 5 Reform MPs. What's the mood like when you guys rocked up?
Well, I think they were shocked that we got in because they're, if you like, their sort of biggest protection, the sort of the equivalent of the Starship Enterprise's sort of force shield was breached. So we're in. The fox is in the chicken coop. We are MPs. We are elected by our constituents, and technically speaking, as you know, Parliament has been undermined by all these quangos and all of this legislation that Tony Blair, particularly, Blair, Brown, Campbell and Mandelson, I've always said should be in the Tower of London for treason. I mean, those 4, and Derry Irvine, by the way. So, I mean, not only did he take us to war on a falsehood, along with Campbell, I mean, these guys are not good guys. They've all made shed loads of money, by the way.
Some of them have podcasts, in fact.
Absolutely. Yeah, so they're shocked that we're in there, but we're in. So Parliament, we are effectively representing our constituents, and Parliament should be sovereign, as you know. So if you go back, in 1688, the Glorious Revolution, we had the Bill of Rights, and ultimately we should be omnipotent. So what we should have is basically a Parliament that is the principal lawmaking governing body. But what's happened is it's been undermined by the quangos, and there's a lot of stuff I'm doing which you'll see later which will expose this. So in answer to your question, I think what we've got to do is now turn the tables on all this. We've got to reverse all this, and what we've got to do is make it clear to the British people that if they elect me, I'm accountable to them, and they can vote me out next time. If they don't think I'm doing a job, get rid of me. That is what Parliament is all about. And the problem though is it's very difficult. The lawyers are making lots of money on the back of it, so they encourage it. You've got the judiciary, which I think are very woke now. They're not as effective as they used to be. They're not necessarily representative of what I would call Middle England common sense and fairness, because Middle England's very fair. And of course, you asked me about Parliament. I think what's happened in Parliament is, again, the servants become the master. So the staff of Parliament are running Parliament, not the MPs. The MPs should be omnipotent, but you get examples like, MPs' expenses going back to 2009-10. You got Dominic Raab, you get some staff member who makes a complaint that you bullied them. Well, what's the definition of bullying? Is it holding people to account? Is it actually asking them to do their job properly? And nowadays, as we know, the definition of offending is it's a bit pathetic, really. And ultimately, I believe the essence of getting at the truth is to have robust debate. You may upset people, you may get a bit offended. That's how you get at the truth. And if you can't take it, don't go into Parliament.
I think that's a fair call. And just a few minutes on reform and where it goes next. I mean, in the last few weeks, we've seen some defections. Dame Andrea Jenkins has come over. Tim Montgomery, the darling of the grassroots conservative movement who set up Conservative Home decades ago, has come on board. What, in your view, does the future of reform look like? Is it, and I say this with respect, but I think it's a fair question, is it taking some people who used to be Tories, bringing them on board to give the party a bit more of a broader church? Is it about also trying to balance with keeping the Tory vote in the Shires, getting that over to reform, but also getting the Labour seats in the north? What does it look like?
Well, I can give you my view on that. Nigel may disagree with this, but I can give you my view. So my view, as I said, is that the Tories have got a vast number of Lib Dems. We don't want those. We want proper, and I don't even think it's an issue of right or left. It's an issue of common sense and logic. We want fair-minded, logical people. So there are 2 or 3 MPs that I like very much. I think I'd love them to come and join us. Nick Candy's just become our treasurer, which is fantastic. We all played a part in that. He and his wife, Holly, are absolutely fantastic. They're big supporters of reform. And I think we've got the forces with us now. So I think we've broken into Parliament, the forces with us. And I even think some of the media are beginning to sit up now. Whereas when I said, 6, 9, 12 months ago, we're going to win the next election, people looked at me as a complete charlatan. You say that now, and it's quite possible. But I think people need to know we're not the finished article. We're a young party. We're a challenger. But I think we offer them the opportunity to release themselves from the manacles of a failed system. And we may make some mistakes. We probably will, because you can't set up a brand new party. But I tell you what, we'll make mistakes that are based on logic and common sense, not mistakes based on what I would call closing down society, removing an aspirant middle class. Aspirant middle class is a key to any form of successful democracy. You can't crush the aspirant middle class, which is what Rachel Reeves is doing with her taxes on farms, taxes on businesses. She's breaking the backbone of Britain and creating a further dependency culture. We don't want that, because that's all she knows. And she thinks she can centrally plan growth. We'll watch. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And she doesn't understand it.
And just to, go back to this issue of transparency and data, something very dear to TPA's heart. So one of our most famous pieces of research is our Town Hall Rich List, which is our look at every single council official receiving over £100,000. We used to have to get that through freedom of information data. We actually had to ask the councils individually. As a result of our work, Gordon Brown actually changed the law and said every council now has to publish that data. So what I'm really interested from you, Rupert, is for our listeners, what is the data, particularly on things like immigration and foreign national offenders, that they might think exists or they might think is in the public domain, but actually is nowhere to be found? Is there any particular data that you find really, wow, I can't believe we don't know that?
Well, there's a lot of data that they say. I think one of the answers I got was they're looking at they're looking at the feasibility of releasing suitable information. Will you tell me what that means? So that was an Angela Eagle response. So I think and as I bumped into her at the tea room, I said, "Where's the answer to my question? You said you were going to give me a data dump. I haven't had it. Hasn't answered the question. You misinformed the House. I need it." She said, "Well, you've been deluging me with so many questions, I can't keep up." I said, "Well, just answer them. That's you're the government. You're supposed to be answering these questions. I'm the MP."
Yeah.
So the answer to your question, Ed, is I think they collect a lot more data than you and I know. And maybe my questions are alerting them to the fact that all is not well in the state of Rome. And a bit like as the penny drops, because again, Parliament's a very incestuous little place where you sort of creep around and your life is not your own, because, you've got this agenda that's very difficult to follow, and you've got all sorts of debates and interviews, and you're in the radio for interview car, and you feel you're doing something, but actually, do you actually know the data behind this? The civil service probably does, if they care to look, but do they look? So my questions maybe making them look, and just maybe they don't like what they're seeing. And you and I know that really for the last 20 years, 15 years, they've been promising lower and lower immigration. And the worst, by the way, on this was Boris, who promised us lower immigration and then basically opened the floodgates to all these people who arguably, if you look at the GDP per capita, you can see they're not contributing. Yes, we've got bigger GDP, but we've got lower GDP per capita, which is the key. You want a rising GDP per capita. So I think the answer to your question is that they may be looking under the duvet because of the questions we're asking. They're thinking, we don't like what we see. And then they actually have to do something if they admit it. So I think, as I say, if people think things are wrong, and you probably know I had an initiative because a lot of Labour MPs think it's okay for all this immigration to happen. So I go, well, why don't you have one of these illegal migrants in your house? That's the answer. We've set up a scheme. You can have one in your house.
Yeah.
There aren't too many takers for that, but so I think the post-war governance has not been good, and maybe the penny is now dropping. The question is, do they know how to solve it, or are they prepared to grasp the nettle to solve it? I think that's a much bigger question, and I can't answer that. But I'm going to keep asking the questions and keep putting them on the spot, and we're going to keep trying to. It gets quite hard to work out what the questions are, actually.
Yeah, well, and a lot of this stuff you're asking about is, things like crimes committed by, foreign nationals, welfare benefits for foreign nationals, all the sorts of things that you'd think that we would monitor, and I assume we do monitor, but all the sorts of things that you'd think there'd be publicly available data, which of course there isn't. But and it's, I think it's particularly good work, but.
You probably saw my tweet on a Lithuanian who's
exactly
repeat offender in my constituency, very light sentence, and he's done it 17 times. I mean, why is he still here? He should be deported. A bit like the 10,500 foreign criminals in our jails. They should be deported. Get rid of them.
Yeah.
They're not contributing to our country. Why are they here?
Yeah.
And these are the questions the British people should start to ask. It's not racist. It's common sense.
Yeah.
And we're letting our own criminals out early to perpetrate crimes on which, and as you know, there's a correlation between once you've offended, you tend to offend again. There's a correlation there. It doesn't matter whether you're British or foreign. So why are we creating victims everywhere? It's unfair on the British public. That's not what government is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be looking after the taxpayers who contribute to our country and our economy and protecting them above all else.
And to segue onto a complete different topic while we have you, Rupert, because of your history as a former chairman of Southampton Football Club, the Football Governance Bill is currently going through Parliament, which, from the TPA's perspective, is one of the most egregious examples of the government looking at an industry that is wildly successful beyond anyone's dreams, and thinking, I know the answer to I know how to bring this down a few pegs. Let's regulate it. So, I want to hear your views on that.
Well, you've probably read my articles on the FCA and the PRA and the Financial Services Market Act.
Financial Conduct Authority. And
all you have to do is look at that. That's your model. So we had, I was brought up in the 80s, which is a wonderful time where, people celebrated success. They celebrated people who made money. They celebrated people who contributed. And it was a great time. We were all free. We could do what we wanted. And Margaret Thatcher gave fresh hope to, those people who were aspirant. And she released the aspirant middle class. And by 2000, we had this fantastic, even after John Major, who was a bit of a disaster. But then you had Blair. And Financial Services Market Act literally tied this wonderful fundraising system where we basically match capital with ideas. And it's destroyed it. So 20 years later, if you read today, there's companies leaving, delisting. I think it's Ashtead, the tool company, is delisting from the UK. And I went to this meeting in Parliament, Elliot, about this football regulators bill. So the model is there. And here we are, a group of sort of 25, 30 MPs, me, right? I listened for a bit. And they're all talking about, they should be regulating this and regulating that. And they all thought it was a great idea. So I stood up and I said, well, why do you think it's a great idea? Where were you all when this league started? Were you there when it was founded? I said, it's the envy of the world. Pays huge amounts of national insurance, huge amounts of tax, because all the player wages go through the payroll.
And brings entertainment. Millions of people every weekend.
Soft power.
Yeah.
It's all over the world. And what's grown more than anything is not the domestic revenues. It's the global revenues, because it's, the revenues in China and India and in all the major emerging economies. So it's hugely powerful. And it was built without a football regulator. So look at the financial markets which they've destroyed, because I always think what happens is the pioneers go into the desert, risk getting an arrow in their back, and they create this wonderful spectacle like the Premier League, which is fantastic. And then suddenly all these people who think they should be part of it, they want to virtue signal, or they want to get involved, or they want to look to their constituents as if they're doing something. Most of them are just fans. And by the way, fans do more damage to football clubs. I love fans. They're very, very important to a football club. But you put them in the boardroom, they're driven by emotion. They're not driven by logic. And as you know, I would say, like, I was criticized as a chairman because I always thought the club was a community asset, above all else, for the next generation of supporters and the next generation of football players. So if you get the finances out of kilter, that disappears for both. So the job is, we never made or lost. We lost some money one year, made some money another. You know, we had our youth academy, which I set up, which produced players like Walcott and Bale and Oxlade-Chamberlain and Andrew Sermon and, you know, all these wonderful players, Luke Shaw. So ultimately, I ran it as a community asset, and I think that's how it should be run. And the Premier League is an example of a deregulated success story. So why do we want, like Gulliver, to tie it down and destroy it, which is what will happen. So other leagues will be celebrating. The Spanish league, the Italian league, maybe they'll make a comeback because they were there before us. You know, maybe some of these other leagues are going to lick their lips and say, it's going to give us an opportunity now.
Before we wrap up this episode of A Nation of Taxpayers, just a couple of, I suppose, prediction questions. You're adamant in your view that there's going to be further greater electoral success for Reform UK in 2029. You've been very clear about that.
Maybe earlier, who knows?
Maybe earlier. Well, that leads me on to one of my questions to you. Do you think Starmer will last the course between now and the next general election?
Look, I think if I'm right about the economy, everything's fine as long as the economy is flying. And the economy, I think as a result of the COVID lunacy, billions and billions of pounds was pumped in through, as you probably know, bounce back loans and Sybil's loans and all sorts of other lunatic financial support, which has distorted the market. And I think it's effectively carried things on to a far greater extent than we might have expected. But now Rachel Reeves, a lot of the wealth creators, they're queuing to get into Monaco. They're queuing to get into Portugal. They're queuing to get into Greece. They're queuing to get into Dubai. And why wouldn't they? You know, they're not going to work their backsides off and build up successful businesses. I nearly laughed when I heard McFadden saying, you know, he wants these entrepreneurs to become public servants, not pay them enough, but expect them to deliver their bit for the government, for the country. Forget it. They're not going to do that. We have to incentivize them to do it. So I think when we get this downturn, this economic downturn, it's going to be absolutely brutal. Because I can tell you businesses are not investing. Businesses are not going to take risk. They're going to draw their horns in. They're going to batten down the hatches. They're going to basically tighten everything up as much as they can and hope they can get through the next 4.5 years without going bust. Now, if they do that, maybe the clouds will clear and the sun will come out. But with this bunch of jokers in charge, I can't see it happening. So get an economic downturn. That's going to clean out a hell of a lot of people, and it could clean out Starmer as well. You can't run a business if you lose your staff, and you can't run a country if you lose your electorate. And let me tell you, it ain't that far away, because look at his popularity rating now. You start getting an economic downturn, they can't blame the Tories. They can't use this £22 million black hole that we hear in Parliament every bloody day, blaming the Tories for it. This is going to be their construct. They are going to be responsible for this. This is going to be wrapped around their neck, and it's going to take them down to the bottom of the sea, because what they've done is lunacy. And they need to slash the size of the state, and they need to encourage the private sector. But they don't get it. We haven't talked about HMRC, by the way. You know, that is another issue we've got to talk about at some stage, whether we have time today. I mean, you know, they are not treating the British public fairly. HMRC has become the enemy of enterprise. So we all pay our taxes in vast quantities. I still get people on Twitter who say people don't pay their taxes. They do pay their taxes. because everybody's tax advisor, everybody honest tax advisor, has been weaponized against them. So I pay their fees, or you pay their fees, but their job is to collect tax from you for the government. And HMRC is not as accountable to us as we are to them. So we've got that balance wrong, and they have now become a predator who is actually a danger to the UK economy. And somebody in Parliament with some knowledge needs to get hold of the HMRC and explain to them that, you collect more tax if you encourage investment, you encourage growth.
Yeah.
But our tax manual, as you probably know, is 23,000 pages long. It's incredibly complicated, and it's got a bit like the Maastricht Treaty, more loose ends than a plate full of spaghetti. And if you want to, you can almost find every rule to tax people. So government says one thing, HMRC does something completely different, and that has to stop. We've got to have open, transparent taxation, which is simple. Hong Kong's tax manual, I think, is 500 pages long. So look, that is another big issue for me that we've got to get right.
More than happy for you to get that message out. Final question. You talked about the Conservative Party a few moments ago. Kemi Badenoch, is she the saviour of the Conservative Party?
Well, I think Kemi Badenoch, she's a charming lady. I don't know her well, but I've spoken to her a few times in Parliament. But I think she's got a huge job. I think she's got an almost impossible job. So the answer to your question, I think, is can she do an Augean Stables job on Conservative Party head office, because that's pretty rotten? And can she then purge herself of those Tories who should be working with the Lib Dems? And then you can actually get a proper Tory party, not a Conservative with a small c, a Tory party, which is what I think the country needs. And if they don't do that, then we are a clean party. So we should run the two in parallel. And if they can't get their act together, the sensible Tories will come to reform, and we will end up forming the next government. That's I think, the way it'll go. But I'm there to be proved wrong. If she's got the strength and the will to go and do what's necessary, I doubt she will be able to do it, and I doubt she's got the will to do it. But that's what she needs to do. Forget being in Parliament, forget, her performance at the dispatch box hasn't been fantastic, to be honest, I'm not being critical of her. But I think she's got a huge job to do before she can even start to reform Britain's oldest political party. And you know what happened to the Whigs. If she doesn't do it, then I think history says it's possible they'll disappear.
Rupert, it's been great having you on this podcast. Thank you. Will you come back again in the future and pop up again?
Anytime. I'm very happy to come and if anybody wants to listen to my rubbish, then I'm always happy to appear.
Been fantastic. Thank you. Rupert Lowe, Reform MP for Great Yarmouth, and also Elliot Keck from the Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you. You've been listening to A Nation of Taxpayers. It is the podcast, the weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, you can support us by following us and subscribing, and also leaving us a 5-star review. Thank you for listening.